Welcome everybody to Foodtech, AgTech, and Sustainable Farming. I hope you enjoy this breakout session. I'd like to start with a round of introductions. So if we can start Kevin and then Bill and then Nir, if you can each give a brief introduction for yourselves. From my standpoint, I'm an investor and active in global food and AgTech businesses, and particularly emphasis on technology. And so I'd like to move on with Kevin, please.
Yeah, thanks, Stephen. Kevin Rabinovich, Global VP of Sustainability here at Mars, a large global privately held food company. I've been here for 28 years, and for the last 15 of that, I've been leading the environmental side of our sustainability program. So I helped start the program and have been running it ever since, and very pleased to be here.
Thank you, Bill.
Bill Rustrick, part of the Clinton Foundation, a small initiative, team of about 30 people working with smallholder groups in Rwanda, Tanzania, and Malawi, encouraging people to see the value of becoming part of a group and then linking them with partners, business partners to support that group, grow and develop economic opportunities. And a lot to do with it right now is sustainability and overcoming or learning to live with the pandemic.
Thank you. Nir?
Hi, good evening. Shalom. My name is Nir Goldstein. I'm the Managing Director for the Food Institute, G5, here in Israel. Globally, we're a non-profit think tank working to make the global food system better for the planet, for people and for animals. We are working with the scientific, business, and policy sectors. We're powered by philanthropy, and we are working with all sectors to advance the global food system. And thank you for having me.
Thank you very much, Nir. So thinking about food and ag tech and farming topic, I'd like each of you to weigh in on what would you say are the greatest challenges facing our global food supply chain right now, especially as we transition from a just-in-time to a just-in-case delivery system, and given the locations of food sources and food processing and delivery challenges. So Kevin, perhaps you can begin.
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to start. So, maybe for first quick bit of context. So Mars is probably best known for our chocolate and confectionery products, but we're actually also the world's largest pet food manufacturer. And then we have a food business, which is based on rice and then, sauces and soups. And so when we think about agriculture, we're basically thinking about all of the grains, all of the animal proteins, all the sweeteners, and then a number of sort of specialty crops, cocoa, peanuts, things, vanilla, mint, things like that. And I think for us, the biggest challenge that we're facing is that our business has grown up, and I guess the world has grown up in a commodity system where all that really mattered were the product attributes of what you were buying. Sort of everything you cared about, you could measure by sticking some sort of a sensor into the bucket of whatever it is that you were buying, fat, protein, microbial content, moisture, whatever. And increasingly, as we think about sustainability and what's needed in the world, we care a lot about things that are not product attributes, but rather are process attributes. So we care about whether there were human rights violations in that supply chain. We care about whether people were paid adequately. We care about what the carbon footprint of the production system was. We care about whether there was deforestation. And you can't measure any of that in the final product. You have to know something about the process. And as soon as you have to know something about the process, you're not talking about a commodity anymore, because that bucket of whatever isn't interchangeable with another bucket of that same material because it came from a different process and you care about the process. And so I think this decommoditization, or we sometimes call it the end of the commodity era, is one of the probably both great challenges and great opportunities of what's going on in the food supply chain.
Thank you. Bill, you want to weigh in?
Yeah, sure. I think the biggest challenge obviously is managing the environment and the impacts that we as a generation are having on the environment, and how that impacts not only on today's generations, but future generations. That's the huge kind of impact. But from a producer, raw material supplier or supporting that. The big challenge that we're always facing is access to seed, fertilizer, crop protection materials, and nothing. Kind of seeing how this began to collapse very quickly in the pandemic. You can draw parallels with that and what will happen, with continued environmental degradation. So we see that as a big challenge, and many farmers in the remote areas that we're working in see that challenge every day. They live and breathe environmental difficulties. We've started a very late rainy season in Malawi. Was a similar thing in Tanzania. Fortunately, this year the rains have continued for us, but it's forcing us to rethink varieties, rethink supply chains, and so that's the big challenge for us as a kind of a representative of the producers.
Okay. Thank you. Nir?
I join Kevin and Bill, and I think we need to put the spotlight on the current way humanity produces protein. As you may know, the global demand for protein that is manufactured through animals, in the 1960s, we produced about 100 million tons a year of meat. In 2050, the FAO, the UN's Food and Agriculture Organization, expects that this is going to be fivefold, so about 500 million tons a year, but the planet remains the same size. And the way humanity produces meat, dairy, and eggs, it brings a lot of challenges to humanity. For instance, global greenhouse gas emissions. About a third of methane is produced through the current way we produce proteins through animals, and about 14.5%, according to the UN, of the global greenhouse gas emissions comes from the animal industry. So that's more than all of the emissions that are coming out of the transportation sector, for example. And the list of challenges goes on and on, from freshwater consumption and pollution to deforestation and manure, antimicrobial resistance and labor, and so on and so forth. So it's a great challenge on the one hand. On the other hand, we're going to consume and produce more and more meat globally. And those challenges, we have to face them.
Thank you. So other than through increasing automation, which we'll touch on in a few minutes, how do you feel, each of you feel that innovation and technology can help in overcoming these challenges? And keep in mind, the more efficient communications we have from B2B and then ultimately getting products to consumers, waste reduction, traceability, etc. Use of technology is going to be more and more important. So I'd like to know if you have specific examples or how you generally feel about that. Why don't we go again with Kevin?
Yeah, I guess two things come to mind, right? So one is, I think one of the major drivers of unnecessary environmental impact, particularly in sort of, let's call it developed world agriculture, sort of industrial ag, if you will, is that there's a highly asymmetric risk curve around the levels of fertilizer and crop protection chemicals you apply, right? So the consequences of under applying are quite severe, and the consequences of over applying are relatively unimportant. It costs you a little bit more money, but other than that, no big deal. And so if you have imprecise data and imprecise tools, it's completely rational to over apply those inputs, because it's cheap yield insurance is sometimes the way it's described. And so I think the opportunity of bringing even better, precision agriculture techniques to some of those more developed ag systems to really sacrifice nothing and get both better economics for the farmer and better environmental outcomes is an obvious innovation in technology space. And then if you look at sort of the other end of the, I guess, technological sophistication spectrum, is we've got a lot of places in the world where more inputs are the right answer, not less. I'm sure some of the work that Bill does, those farmers would be in a much better place and would need less land to grow more crops, and there'd be less pressure on deforestation if they had access to the right inputs. And so I think using innovation to shift excess use of inputs from places where they don't need to be to places where they do need to be is a tremendous opportunity to get better outcomes all around.
Thank you. And I would add an example would be for you, what you just said would be that more and more sensors are not starting to be deployed for application of inputs from fertilizer to all sorts of items, including water. But also, if you look at it from the standpoint of, particularly in the US, where flood irrigation has always been the mainstay, and not wasting water for the future, regardless of where it's located, is important. And then, Bill, I would segue to you, because since you are located in Africa, Africa has some unique distinctions from the US and the European geographies.
Yeah, I mean, the big use of innovation and technology in the areas that I work is more to do with communication, the ability to communicate information about market prices, technical information about products that can be used, where they're located, when they will be available, and also the use of renewable energy. That Malawi has 18% of the population has access to electricity, and typically we'll have 4 or 5 hours each day without mains electricity from the main power supplier. So that translates into rural economies where they don't have access to any energy, any power. So looking at simple ways in which we can get them access to solar panels that create some productive use of energy. So for example, we have warehouses that supply the power to clean seed, or to kind of provide extraction fans to keep the grain in good state. But the big thing is actually the real value at this stage in these economies is access to information. What is it that they can use? How can they best use it? So the technology, being given access to technology and then being given an opportunity to be able to use it in a way that fits their needs at this particular stage is so critical. So those are the two things that we're always using, kind of technology and innovation. And the innovation comes from the farmers themselves. We've got at the moment we've got a cook stove that runs. It's moving away from charcoal, which is the typical way of cooking in these parts of the world, to kind of pellets that need a fan that's generated using a mobile phone small battery. And kind of that's come about through a group of growers coming up with a solution to reduce their dependence on charcoal, peri-urban areas. But it's you see that every day, how they're using technology in a way that overcomes the issues that they're facing.
And does your initiative also include where you help those that now have data on how to use data? Because how to use seems to be equally as important as having it.
Absolutely, and that's a key part to how do we get groups of people to use this information and develop opportunities, economic opportunities, business opportunities to actually move that next stage. So kind of that, and it's we're not prescribing what they should be using. It's kind of sharing with them information, taking the journey with them, and kind of learning together how we can best, use technology. Our real strength is linking them to different business partners, be they technology partners, market partners, finance partners, input supplier partners. This is kind of the real kind of springboard that we use to create this change.
Thank you. And Nir?
Yeah. So when you talk about food tech in Israel, 70% of time, at least if you follow the money, you talk about alternative proteins. We saw an investment of about $860 million in Israel in 2021 in food tech companies, and about more than $630 million, if I'm correct, were invested in alternative protein companies. Now, what are those? We are trying to meet the challenges that I described earlier and also Kevin and Bill with regards to the current way we are producing food globally. And we have three leading technologies currently active here in Israel and globally. One is cultivated meat. We are taking cells without significantly harming any animals and growing them in culture to food dishes like steaks or chicken. So for example, we have the world's largest cultivated meat company here in Israel called Future Meat in Nest Ziona, and they raised over $400 million to date to build the world's first cultivated meat factory, which they will begin working on in 2022 this year in the States. We also have Aleph Farms, a company that is producing cultivated steaks here in Israel, which I had the honor to serve their product to Prime Minister Bennett, and before him Netanyahu. We're getting a lot of policy support. The second technology is plant-based foods. So for example, we are seeing companies like the Israeli startup Redefine Meat, which are using 3D printers to print steak out of plants, essentially, and their products, as opposed to the cultivated meat sector, the products are already in the market. In Israel, you can go to over 250 restaurants in Tel Aviv and elsewhere, but also in Europe and hopefully soon in the States, and eat a 3D printed steak. Or a company like Equinome, going back to what Bill said earlier, we have a companies working on novel breeding technologies, for example, doubling the amount of protein in a soy bean, for example. And the third technology, we call it fermentation, which is as old as food, of course. We use it for beer making and bread and wine. Nowadays, we are using fermentation, for example, in yeast. We have a company in Israel called Milk, and they are creating dairy proteins, which are biologically exactly the same as you would get from a cow. So it's not a replacement. It's identical, but it wasn't produced using a cow, but in a fermenter like the ones we are making beer in using yeast. So a lot of exciting technologies, and of course, most of them are targeting the Western markets, which have the ability to pay for the scale up of those technologies. Nowadays, we know that about a third of the population in those Western markets are looking to reduce their consumption of animal-based products. And one of the challenges that is not tapped and might relate to what Bill discussed earlier is how can we bring those novel technologies also here in Israel to meet the challenges of also the developing world. And that's to come.
Thank you. I think I'm glad you added the last part, because it's very important to bring the technology to the developing world, but it's also so far as what I see, it's different technologies are more applicable to the developing world, and we have to be very careful on technological growth in the developing world, not to have them not have sufficient employment and food security, because they're not on the same pace as I think as we are right now.
At the end of the day, technologies are being developed where the financing to develop them is coming from. And right now we are depending on the private sector and the food companies and the VCs who are looking to make the most profits, of course, and that's reasonable. This is why we at the Good Food Institute are working with governments and international parties like the UN, the FAO, and the World Bank, and partners in Africa and in Asia, for example, the Global South in general, in order to make sure that we have innovation and scientific research targeted at those areas in the world which the private sector is not targeting enough.
Okay, thank you. So going with Bill first this time. Bill, can you, given the current labor challenges, how do you see labor versus automation evolving over the next decade to address supply chain challenges?
Well, you'd think I'd say that we need to think about ways in which to keep people engaged in agriculture, but the natural progression is that people tend to move out of agriculture and move into other industries as economies across the world develop. That's just the kind of natural evolution. And I'm surprised that kind of major problems that we have even in a very agricultural based economy in Malawi, it's still an issue with labor. There isn't enough labor to apply fertilizer, or there isn't enough labor to do the harvesting. And everybody's looking at ways in which they can get access to their crop being harvested at the right time, planted at the right time. So what I think is going to happen is that will, kind of naturally happen, more and more automation, mechanization. But I think the other thing that's going to happen is people are going to, around the world, are going to understand more and more that whatever you eat or consume has an environmental impact that's going to have implications, ramifications, and we're going to become, as a society, more aware of that. And we're going to become, as Kevin was talking about earlier, more aware of this impact, but also how do we differentiate? So if I'm buying, some processed meat, what is the impact it's having on the environment? In the same way that we use, look at organic food, does that become much more important to me because I know this is having an impact? And what we're doing in all three countries we work in is looking at ways in which smaller scale producers have an enormous impact on CO2 emissions, and how can we look at ways in which they can be supported to reduce the CO2 emissions, to reduce the environmental impact. Okay, a lot of it at the moment is planting trees, but there's also simpler things or kind of more immediate benefits, such as intercropping certain crops. We've got an example running at the moment in Malawi where we're intercropping soybeans with macadamias. Macadamia takes a long time to reach maturity, but the soybeans are providing the way in which growers are getting access to funds to pay for those macadamias to get to a point where they can benefit more and overcome a lot of the labor problems they're seeing growing soy crops. And it also supports the environment. There's not so much cultivation of the land, and the crop, the tree crop, is obviously sequestering carbon. So kind of looking at it in a much more holistic way, and not simply, okay, this technology could take away people's jobs. We find that doesn't happen. Automation and technology gives you the ability to differentiate the products you're producing, and also supply in a much more timely way, and on and on and on.
Right. Thank you very much. Kevin, can you address how you see the supply chain affected by labor shortages?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've certainly seen, and this maybe goes back to something Bill said earlier about sort of how the stress response of the system to the challenges of COVID might be a harbinger of what we'll see with the stresses of climate change, and sort of realizing that perhaps our global food infrastructure was not quite as resilient and robust as we thought it was. And so I think we will continue to see those sort of short-term stresses and labor shocks, from a range of be they pandemics or large-scale conflicts or other issues. But I think there's the pressures of climate change and climate migration are gonna impact labor availability unfavorably or favorably, depending on whether you're a country that's losing people or gaining people in that migration movement. I think the other thing that's maybe interesting to think about is, again, in sort of, industrial or developed market agriculture, I think there has been in many commodities, there's been a sort of de-laboring of the farm, right? More and more automation, bigger and bigger tractors that need fewer and fewer people, and so on and so forth. And, I think one of the things that we're likely to see as we think about, more regenerative models that maybe sound a little bit more like what Bill was talking about, where you're intercropping and there's different species and more complicated rotations, you actually need to bring some of that labor, at least intellectual labor, back to the farm, where farms become more complicated and you've got to be paying attention to more things and thinking about more things. And so automation works best when you've really figured out what it is you want to do with people, but you can do it better with technology, and more efficiently and lower cost and so on and so forth. And I think we're I think we're not in that phase of the cycle on sort of more regenerative large scale farming models. I think we're at the other phase where it needs more people to sort of wrap their heads around what to do in active management. And then once that gets better figured out at scale, maybe automation comes back in. But I think there's an increase in I guess I'll call it the intellectual labor associated with large scale agriculture, if not the physical labor as well, but at least the intellectual labor. I think it's going to be a more complicated, more intellectually challenging, and probably more intellectually rewarding sector going forward, which some people will be excited about and some people will be terrified by.
That's a very well put. Thank you. I think the Hebrew University certainly can be very instrumental in advancing that, and perhaps programs that train people that work in agriculture that never thought they'd receive some additional education to grow in a more sophisticated type of process and help, address labor shortages. Nir, your thoughts on labor challenges, please?
Yeah, thanks, Stephen. A lot of times when people talk about the labor challenges, we hear the term nowadays just transition. We know that we can't go on producing food the same way that we have. The world is changing, labor is changing, and we need to make sure that everybody is a fair part of the future of food. A lot of it comes together with education, as you mentioned, and infrastructure. And let me take the Israeli angle, if I may. Israel is somehow known for its agricultural technologies and food technologies, but actually we import about 80 to 90% of our meat consumption. So in terms of national food security, that's very poor. And the Israeli food system or the food industry is going through a change nowadays. We only export about 5% of what we produce. So all of it goes locally. So it's a huge challenge also in terms of labor. However, when it comes to food tech, we are currently working with the Israeli government, and our expectations is that in the next decade, the Israeli food industry is actually going to double itself in size in terms of employment, thanks to novel technologies of food tech. So from an industry that employs about 60,000 Israelis, we're going to see 50, maybe more, 1,000 more jobs entering Israel. But in order to meet that demand, we need to have the value chain to educate those future employees of our food industry, and also, of course, build that whole industry from innovation to scale. That's a huge challenge in terms of also in terms of policy and regulation. Yeah, so a huge challenge, but also a huge opportunity.
So Nir, can you share with us any insights around the work that you do and some of the work coming out of Hebrew University or Israel a little bit more broadly, just taking a few minutes?
Sure. The Hebrew University is very well situated to tackle the future of food. It has some multidisciplinary areas of expertise which are needed to produce the future of food. We are talking about fields all the way from traditional agriculture and plant science to, of course, food engineering, but also tissue engineering on the other hand, and stem cell biology, so it's really multidisciplinary. And another thing that the Hebrew University is really great at in particular is technology transfer. So we saw some very promising startups coming out of the Israeli University, from the Hebrew University lately. One of them, as I mentioned, is Future Meat, which is the world's largest cultivated meat company, headed by Professor Yaakov Nachmias, who is also a speaker here in Nexus Israel. So that's very exciting. Another company coming out of the Rehovot branch of the Hebrew University is called Save or Eat by Professor Oded Shosayov, and they are doing 3D printing of plant-based burgers, and they already have a product in pilot stage in Israel as of early 2022, traded on the Israeli Tel Aviv Stock Exchange. Another company is called Kinoko, and they are actually my hope for the developing world. They are using fermentation, or actually mushrooms that grow on grains, and through that process they alter and make the nutritional composition of grains much more nutritious. And that process could also be done, in huge factories, I don't know, in the States, but also in small holding farms in Central Africa. So that's a very exciting process that we are also seeing coming out of the Hebrew University. But I think we have just started. So Foodtech is a relatively new term introduced in Israel, I don't know, in 2015, more or less. And when we analyze what's happening in the Hebrew University, we see that we have over 60 academic research labs with research that is applicable for what we are doing. And all we need to do that and to promote it is using funds for research. Currently, G5 is funding about 30% of the research in this field going on in Israel. And we are also giving some courses. The world's first course in alternative protein research was given by us in the Hebrew University in 2018. And by then, since then, it's been also given worldwide in dozens of universities, but the Hebrew University was the first. So yeah, a lot of exciting things happening.
Great, thank you very much. Bill, can you sort of segue into that from the perspective of your development initiative in Africa?
Sure, I think there's a lot of great research coming out of kind of the university and Israel more generally. We always look to Israel for irrigation solutions. But the challenge for us is always about how we get access to that technology in a way that people can kind of access it, kind of finding the funds for it, getting the capital behind it to support, how can we adapt what exists from a kind of university point of view or already exists in a more developed economy. How do we now adapt that and get that, give that access to many people in an African situation, in the developing economy situation where we find ourselves. So that's always the big challenge that we come up with. We know the irrigation works, but it's in how do we get all this together. It's not just the technology; it's also how do we get access to funds, how do we get the financiers supporting it, how do we develop markets that come from that technology, and kind of how do we support all the other kind of requirements from input suppliers to actually make the best use of that technology, and how do we adapt it to kind of these particular groups with less spending power, giving them the same advantage that would arise from commercial farms, for example. So those are always the challenges that we have to address. And
thank you. I'm sorry.
No.
Kevin, can you just take a couple of minutes and then we'll go to Q&A on that point?
Yeah, if I'm honest, I don't have a whole lot to add to what Bill and Nir already said, so I'm happy to pivot to the audience Q&A.
Okay, thank you. So I would say that we can now open up for some questions from the audience, please. And you can either direct them in general or you can direct them at any of the participants. I see there's, okay, I guess I'll ask this question to, put this question to Nir. How can behavioral scientists contribute to this area?
It's a great question. Thank you, Michal. We don't see enough research in this area. As I mentioned before, most of the research is being funded by some entity, and of course, the research that is tied to IP and technology is ahead of other types of research. I think going into consumer acceptance is a huge challenge. What really makes the consumer go and repurchase products. We think we know a lot about that, but most of the challenges in our food system have been around for decades. We've known about them. However, it doesn't change the patterns of how we produce and consume foods. And in fact, more of our challenges are only going to multiple in the coming decades. So we're working on the technologies on the one hand, but the greatest, I think, challenge of our time, at least here in Israel with regards to technology, is that we are now understanding when the first products are coming to market, it's not only about time to market, it's about time to acceptance. What would make the consumer really want to purchase those products? Studies tell us it's going to be about price, taste, and convenience most of the time. But what about the Y generation? Are we really going to see more consumers worldwide caring about the environment? Do they really care about nutrition? And in the studies that we have in J5, we see that there is a difference, major difference, as you might know, Michal, because I see you from that field, between what the consumers say they want to see and what actually drives the long-term purchasing. So there's a lot to be unfolded here together with the new technologies that are coming to market.
Thank you. So I should have pointed out that question was from Michal Shahilovitz, and maybe one of you can undertake this question. If not, I'll answer it. But from Ludwig Zizmansky, can you address the gargantuan waste of food that is thrown away as a result of the frantic race for making money by selling what people will buy and discarding the rest?
Yeah, I'll take that one. And actually, I think this connects into Michal's question about behavioral science, right? Is we like to think we are all rational decision makers, but all the evidence suggests otherwise, right? We make decisions for less than rational reasons, and I think food waste is. In part, food waste is a result of a desire for, people want value for money, and that means you set up a marketplace where one of the ways to compete is to offer more product for the same price. And as a consumer, you go, ooh, that's good because I'm getting more for the same price, or right. But sometimes that more is not more that you need, but it still feels like value for money. So you end up buying a larger portion, and you get into a bit of a counterproductive arms race between competitors in the market trying to supply and meet that consumer demand and expectation, when in reality, you'd want a system that works the other way. And so I think that's, getting to sort of the root of that, where, when you sell products that drive food waste, you don't, as is the current case, basically get rewarded by market dynamics for doing that. And I think that sort of gets to, it's very difficult to do sort of a unilateral disarmament strategy in that competitive context. You need to find a way to shift consumers' thinking. And I think there's also significant opportunities to design supply chains that are less prone to waste. So some of the various preservation technologies, some of which are not high tech or even new tech, to make more things shelf stable or ambient temperature is a significant opportunity to mitigate food waste. But yeah, there's a cultural, behavioral layer to that, which is really quite significant on the consumer end. In the supply chain, of course, there's all kinds of opportunities to be smarter about food waste and minimize waste and loss at farm and in the supply chain. But at the consumer level, there's a real behavioral component there.
And I'll add that, there's different areas of waste. It's a much more complex issue, but the way that food producers make money is by utilizing every input, and sometimes multiple ways, because inputs are altered once they're first used and create byproducts. And there's a cycle that occurs initially of disposal of, the remainder, if you will. But smart businesses and businesses that are cognizant of not wasting and have the appropriate, in my view, approach to things will find a way for those all to develop at one point or another into a byproduct, whether it's an animal feed. There's many different aspects. And the aspect of waste, for example, from crops stems at the field. And what's the revolution going on in the US right now, at least, is that application of pesticides, whether not in a negative sense, I'm talking about it could be natural types of, which there are, pesticides as well as chemical, to reduce waste, sort of like irrigation flooding, over the historical production of agriculture. Both of those are undergoing massive changes right now, where you can see massive reductions in waste. But you still have distribution, you still have other aspects. For example, like Bill being in Africa, distribution is completely different in Africa than it is in the US. So Bill, I don't know if you want to weigh in on that at all. You don't have to, I can go to the next question.
Well, I was just going to go to a simple example of something we've worked with in Rwanda, where a lot of the maize there is harvested during the kind of a wet period in seasons. They have 2 or 3 growing seasons being on the equator. And so kind of maize is produced typically in season A. It was prone to very high fungal disease because of it being harvested relatively wet. We provided some simple innovation to dry it under cover. And we were able to support a number of growers actually get better prices for that higher quality. And we'd significantly reduce the waste because no one would eat this very high aflatoxin maize. So that's just one example of how it works. But yeah, I do agree with you. There is an enormous amount of waste associated with huge transports. And lack and just poor timing, kind of inputs arriving at the wrong time means that a lot of waste.
The other aspect of waste is that, as I'm sure you appreciate, is that food products on all the retail shelves around the world will have various different methods, so like use by dates, etc. And those are based on a concept of code. When is it okay to eat it? When it is not okay is not really the determination. Bill's smiling. The determination is from the lawyers getting involved, and as a lawyer, but I'm in the business as well. There's a role, but too much of a role is let's shorten the lifespan, which I don't agree with. Shorten the lifespan of the food product, and then we're throwing away good food that can be safely consumed. And there is a difference between types of food. Some have live bacteria, they can go on for a long time safely, others cannot. So it's a much more complicated, and perhaps Hebrew University will have something more detailed on waste, because I think it's critical towards the future supply of food. Now, one question that came in from, or I think it was a request from Pamela Dubin, was maybe each of you can take a couple of minutes and share insights in connection with your work, and what you would like to see, like I think she used the term moonshot, what you'd like to try to accomplish. And I'll let you each pick your own time frame, whether it's 2, 3, 5, 10 years. So Bill, you want to tackle that first?
Yeah, sure. I mean, the big kind of excitement that I'd like to see happen over the next 5 to 10 years, sooner if we can, is getting people to be recognized for producing in an environment that reduces the impact that food producing, including the waste, has on the environment. So, we're all waking up to the impact of, it's not just what we're doing today and the impact on this generation. I think it's the unheard of, unrepresentative future generations. So what can we do as a farming community, as a food supply chain, to reduce the impact So there is an environment that is, kind of capable of continuing to support future generations. So that's the big issues that I'm coming up with, and I'm surprised that the communities that we work with understand this, very clearly, because they're living with climate change every day. They realize the impact that they're having on their environments. And there's lots of good stories on people who are producing charcoal. They know the difficulties, but they're looking for different opportunities to move away from that and come up with quite good solutions when you give them. So I think there's an ability there. It's just, as we talked earlier, it's a psychology behind it, and changing people's behavior is difficult.
Thank you. Kevin, you want to weigh in on that?
Yeah, I mean, so many things come to mind. I guess the one I'll choose is that there's a pivot in the mindset of the agricultural community from dirt to soil, and the distinction I'm making there is, dirt is a inert substrate into which you stick a seed and some inputs and some water, and it holds the roots so the plant doesn't fall down while it's growing, but otherwise it's just substrate. To soil, which is actually a living, functioning ecosystem, which is contributory to what you're trying to do, and sort of in the extreme articulation of this, you'll hear some very passionate farmers say things like, my job is to farm the soil. The soil's job is to grow my crop. I don't have to worry about that. As long as I take care of the soil, it'll take care of the crop for me. And I guess maybe tied to that, I'll go back to this behavioral thing since Michal got started on that is, one of the things, and I haven't actually seen the study, but I've heard it repeated a number of times, so I'll risk doing the same here, is that, one of the strongest predictors in U.S. agriculture of whether farmers will adopt sort of these, I guess, recently novel strategies around regenerative agriculture. One of the strongest predictors is whether their father is still alive, which it's counter, right? So if your father's still alive, you're less likely to adopt some of these new practices. And the explanation anecdotally given is that people just don't want to have the argument every Sunday night over dinner about why you're not farming the way I used to farm and what's this newfangled nonsense, right? So even though it's rational and there's a good case for it, and right, that people just are like, what, it's not worth the brain damage, and so I think that would be my hope is that we could embrace sort of that level of change in thinking.
Well, as someone who's experienced the brain damage over the course of not just myself with my father, but myself with my sons, we all have a different approach, and they all seem to be important and they all seem to work. So, but you're correct, on typical family farm, it is problematic to affect change. Nir, I'm going to sort of pivot. If you want, you can address that, but maybe you can also, if can you address sort of what's going on in Israel and the public-private partnership, not the original, not today's PPP, but the real PPP of public-private partnership and Israeli programs that help develop a lot of this technology.
Sure. A few thoughts come to mind. First of all, with regarding to what Kevin mentioned, I'm a third generation at the Hebrew University. So I listened to my father and it worked well, I think. But with regards to the moonshot, to put things in perspective, the global food industry is about $12 trillion, not billion, a year, and about 20% out of that is meat production. So current projections are that by 2030, about 10% of global protein production will bypass the cow, meaning we will move from animal industry to alternative proteins. So 10% by 2030 out of a $2 trillion annual, $2 trillion annually of a market. That's a huge opportunity, hundreds of billions of dollars every year. In Israel, we are currently with about 16% of the dairy market is alternative proteins, and about 6% of the Israeli meat market is alternative meats. And that's 4 times more than what we currently have in the US. So Israel is ahead of the market, and my moonshot guesstimate is that by 2030, will be at about 30% of the dairy market in Israel, maybe 15-20% of the meat market. So sometime in between 2040 and 2050, alternative foods will bypass the ones that are coming from animals. And with regards to your question about the public-private relationship, I can say that we worked in Israel to develop a national policy plan and to find really the gaps in the market, because the way we look at the government intervention is that it only needs to act where the the private market cannot solve its own gaps. We identify 3 main gaps. One is academic knowledge. We need to have more and more research. And unfortunately, we don't have, as I said earlier, enough funding to do that. And there's a huge potential, of course, in the Hebrew University, but also elsewhere. The second is infrastructure, especially for scale-up. We have innovative solutions, but currently there are startups. In order to change the global food system, you need to have ideas and innovation that works in scale. We don't currently know how to do that in Israel. We have a gap in infrastructure that could do that. So that's 2. And 3 is regulation. Israel is not adapted to be a world leader in this field, meaning that when we have innovative solutions come to market, they usually come here after they went through the regulators of the US or the EU or other places. So we rely on other regulators to do the hard work for us, and then we prove them if they did it before us. Nowadays, we are, for the first time in history, we have the food innovation coming from Israel, and the Israeli regulators are the first to be approached by the startups, and they're asking, the regulator need to ask tough questions. It's just like the FDA in drugs sometimes. When it comes to novel foods, you have to make sure they are safe for consumption. So that's the 3rd pillar of the gaps that the Israeli government needs to act on. And I'm happy to say that in the last year or 2, we've had great traction working with the Israeli government, from the Prime Minister himself. I'll tell you a brief story. Before Prime Minister Bennett went for his first meeting with President Biden in October, I got a call asking if I can come meet the Prime Minister to brief him on what's going on in Israeli Foodtech. And when I met the Prime Minister, just before he took off, he told me that he believes, he knows that President Biden is very interested in the global climate crisis. And we know that Israel is tiny. Our contribution to the climate crisis is relatively small, of course, but our ability to contribute is huge thanks to our technologies. So I think there's a lot to be done in terms of the public and private relationship.
Thank you. And I would add that for those on the call, the Volcani Institute, which is part of the agricultural ministry in Israel, has extensive activity in more basic all the way up to more commercialized science, but their science approach are thoughtful science that takes quite a bit of time. You also have the Innovation Authority, which provides some funding along with either investors or philanthropists that want to see a certain solution or problem rather addressed. And they also provide financing for new fledgling businesses to an extent where it's more grants that you repay if you're successful, but otherwise there's no financial obligation that follows that. And there's a number of other very good programs, in particular through Hebrew University, as well as the other universities. For at Hebrew University, it's called Yasum, where they commercialize products that have gotten approval or are near to get approval, so that they can be out in the marketplace. Could be products, could be processes. It's a whole panoply of opportunities to make everything better for all of us that are consumers. I think we have about 4 minutes left. I'm just going to quickly see if we have a particular question. So I saw one from Benjamin Espinola regarding insect protein. So I'll add that on insect protein, I did speak with, I'm not going to say who, but a very famous investor globally. And I had a discussion with him saying that I found it very interesting because I had been looking at the insect protein space, that he made an investment, and he laughed and he said, yes, he said, but who would have thought that insects can become ill just like the rest of us and get a cold? So I asked him what he was talking about, and he told me, you, like any other animal, you have to take care of the insects, because if they become ill, you then have to just, terminate them. And and especially when it's new technology, it's a significant cost. So I think there's a role for insect protein. Some would say that it's there's human appetite. Others, for certain, there is for certain types of animal feed, etc. All of which would help us reduce carbon footprint, etc. So does either of you want to address that?
Well, so I guess our pet food team would never forgive me for not pointing out that we have launched an insect-based protein or insect protein-based pet food called Love Bug that's available in the UK. And so, yeah, I think it's an interesting area to explore. I mean, I think our point of view on this is that the question should always be about not what's the right strategy, but what are the outcomes and the impacts of the strategy that you're pursuing, right? So we're all for anything that helps cut our carbon footprint, our land footprint, our water footprint, that addresses social issues in the supply chain. And so we're sort of dogmatic about the impacts and not so dogmatic about the particular raw materials or the strategy. So, but yeah, it's definitely an interesting area, and possibly one way of dealing with food waste that you can't prevent is using it as a feedstock for insects.
Thank you. So I'd like to take this time then to the last minute to thank Kevin, Nir, and Bill for your time and your very thoughtful answers. I'm sure the audience appreciated this, and not sure how I transfer this back. Maybe there's some new technology from Israel. Tell me how to do that. But I guess until we get cut off, Nir, do you want to make any closing comments about the Good Food Institute, which I think is a great organization?
Thank you so much. I just want to say to our audience, don't underestimate the power of philanthropy to make change where change is needed. I think that's true also for Bill, and thank you for everything you're doing in Africa. And thank you also, Stephen and Kevin, for today's session.
Okay. Bill, anything closing?
No, thanks. Thank you for giving me the time to be able to attend and listen to some useful discussion and thought, and kind of plenty to kind of share with the rest of the team tomorrow and later on kind of some ideas. Certainly, I'm coming away with a lot of good ideas. So thank you. Okay, Kevin, last closing comment before they cut us off.
Yeah, thanks everyone for joining. Thanks to my fellow panelists and Steve for moderating us. It's been a pleasure.